Alright, this video is going to be the first of quite a few in a series on how to solve quadratic equations. We're also going to focus a little bit on solving some other polynomial equations, but we're going to focus mostly on quadratics, which means that we have a highest degree of 2, if you remember from our terms and degrees conversation in the last video. So when we're solving quadratics, or when we're solving any polynomial, we're looking for where the graph is crossing the x-axis. In a quadratic, it will cross either 0 times, 1 time, or 2 times, which we'll talk about later. Your equation should always be set to 0. If it's not set equal to 0, you might have to do a little bit more work to get it there. Solving an equation is different than just factoring an expression. You're solving an equation, so you will have final answers of x equals something. You should always look for a greatest common factor first. And make sure you don't divide by a variable, because you could lose a root, and I'll show you what that looks like on the next examples. So, here we are solving some polynomials. This first one is a quadratic, because it's x to the second power. You guys have studied parabolas before. Everything is set equal to 0, so we're good here. So the next thing you want to do is look for a greatest common factor. So what's the biggest thing that 4x squared and 2x have in common? I'm going to say that's a 2x. And if I take a 2x out of 4x, I'm going to be left with 2x. If I take a 2x out of negative 2x, I have a minus 1. It's all equal to 0. Now, in mathematics, we have a special zero product property, which means that if I have two things, 1, 2, that are being multiplied together to equal 0, that means either the first one must be 0 or the second one must be 0. They might both be 0, okay, but one or the other has to be 0, because in order for two numbers to multiply to 0, one of them has to be 0. So then we can solve each of these separately. Well, if 2x equals 0, divide both sides by 2, x is 0. Here we're going to add 1 and then divide by 2, so x is equal to 1/2. So we had two solutions to this quadratic equation right here. Okay? Again, this only works because you have two things that are being multiplied to 0. Okay? Must be set equal to 0. Now, I mentioned on the previous slide, make sure you don't divide by a variable. And what I mean by that is if I take this same equation, and instead of applying a GCF, I instead add 2x to the other side, and then try to divide things out. So divide each thing by 2, I'd be left with 2x squared over here, and x over here. And then divide everything through by x, I would get 2x equals 1, x equals 1/2. But I only have one answer, and I know that if I do things the proper way, I'm supposed to have 2. Don't do this. You're going to lose a root, and then you're going to be missing answers when all is said and done. Alright, this one over here, we have a cubic polynomial, because it's x to the third is our highest power. Again, we're going to set everything equal to 0, and we're going to look for a greatest common factor between 3x to the third and 18x squared. Well, the most that they have in common is definitely going to be a 3, and then x to the second I can take out. If I take out a 3x squared from 3x to the third, so remember 3x to the third means this, and I'm going to take out 3x squared, I'm left with x, minus, if I take out a 3x squared from here, I'm going to be left with a negative 6 equal to 0. Using that zero product property, I have two things that are multiplying together to be 0, so that means either the first one is 0 or the second one is 0. Now these equations are much easier to solve. Divide by 3, x squared equals 0, which means x equals plus or minus the square root of 0, but we know that the square root of 0 is just 0. You don't have to worry about plus or minus. And here we're going to add 6 to the other side, so x is equal to 6. Final answer. Now, because I started with x to the second, at most I can have 2 answers. Because I started with x to the third, at most I could have 3 answers. In this case I have 2. This one we're going to call a double root, because it's going to be a positive or negative version of 0, but we know that that just means 0. And that's it. Greatest common factor. Look for that first when you are solving polynomial equations. Greatest common factor first.